All right, all right. Here we go. It's 2025, the first episode of Well Dwellers podcast. Man, I am excited to share with you today a conversation I had not quite a month ago with Cynthia Tam and Krista Ewert. Before I get to introducing them, though, I want to share just quickly with you that at the end of today's episode, both Cynthia and Krista share a bit about the activities of what Deeper Communion is doing online. I'm excited for that, to see their online growth beginning to take place. But also, I just want to also say that here in the West, with Deeper Communion provinces like BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, we are busy at work trying to put together a 4-week or a 4-event series in April and May that we're looking at a theme of new body, new church. And I would love for you to be able to stay tuned and watch for those events. You can be in person if you are in the city, and you can also catch it online. So more to come. Keep your ears and eyes out for that. But let's get to today's episode. I'm talking with Cynthia Tam, who is a pastor with the Living Room Church and the National Coordinator of Disability Ministries with the Alliance Canada. And Krista Ewert is also joining us as a public communicator and author. She's an advocate for the disabled community, and together, all of us are putting some community work together around the Deeper Communion group, which you'll hear lots about today. We talk quite a bit about disability language and how we define and find meaning in the word disability, but we also talk about church and the role of community and church with those who have disabilities. So this is going to be an exciting time. Lots of rich stuff here. I look forward to hearing what you might say in response, but also please do hit the subscribe button. We are the Well Dwellers podcast is on most podcast platforms, whether it's Apple podcasts or Spotify or Amazon. We are on pretty much all of them. So look us up and find us. We also have our YouTube channel, and please visit the at the bottom of the well.com website, where you'll find lots of good stuff there too. So definitely sign up for those emails. Anyways, let's get this conversation rolling. Okay, welcome to the Well Dwellers podcast. I'm Eric Freiberger, and I'm coming to you from Treaty 7 Lands, Calgary, Alberta. I'm excited to have Cynthia Tam and Krista Ewert joining us here today as they are coming from Ontario. We're going to talk a bit about the Deeper Communion and how they have been advocating and building community for disabilities across here in Canada. This is going to be an excellent conversation. I'm excited to get started. Welcome, Cynthia and Krista.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. So we'll dive right in here. Maybe you can share a bit about yourselves and how you either started Deeper Communion and how you connected to it, and a bit of its storyline, if you don't mind.
Cynthia, why don't you go first, since you joined first?
Okay. Yes, I'll start it if I have. So a bit about myself. I am a pastor in Toronto. Our church is called the Living Room Church. It's called that because we are a semi-house church model. So we have big and small gatherings. That's what I mean. Anyway, and I'm with the Alliance Canada, so I'm also a national coordinator for disability ministries with the Alliance Canada. So that is a national portfolio, meaning I'm my description is to equip churches and help them with disability ministry. Not a very good name, but that's what has been around for I don't know how many years. So that's part of what I do. And so actually I was appointed to the position in 2016, I believe. And right away what I did was recognizing that, the alliance is still small and the job is big. So I started right away connecting with churches, mostly in Toronto at the time, to set up an interdenominational church network with church leaders who are doing some work with people with disability. So that was actually in 2016, and we did some webinars. We did a mini conference until I really can't tell you how it all happened. It's probably with Neil, yes, who was with Christian Horizons then. And then he connected us with Thomas Reynolds of UT, Bill Silas of McMaster, and Large, and anyway, a couple other organizations. And then we started talking. That was the seat of the first conference that became a Deeper Communion. So the first conference was in 2018 at UT. And so the interdenominational church network was part of it in organizing it. And it's actually, we kind of merged into being one since then. And then, the rest kind of history. We've been doing annual conference since then. So, I stopped there and then Krista can jump right down.
Great. Well, hello, my name is Krista Ewert. I'm actually joining you from the west coast of Canada, the traditional lands of the Coast Salish people, specifically Tsawwassen First Nations. And I'm a bit of a latecomer to Deeper Communion, but previously I lived in England where I was the communications lead for the national ministry team of the Church of England. And part of that role was working with the diocesan disability advisors and the national advisor for disabilities for the Church of England, which was a huge privilege to be able to work with them and to just talk about how we can make churches more accessible from all different aspects of our worshiping time. My personal lived experience of disability is through my daughter, who is 15 and has Down syndrome and is still in the house because she slept in, so she might make an appearance. But ever since she was born, I have just noticed that there are definitely ways that we can improve our spaces and our gatherings to help our congregations understand the contributions of all individuals and what we like to call the kingdom praxis of just that upside down kingdom where Jesus, he values the contributions of everybody and recognizing, like the children and the widows and the orphans and that everybody can come to him. So I've seen it through, Sunday school. I have also worked in ministry myself as a children's and families pastor, trying to make our Sunday school programs as accessible as possible. I currently, I say I'm a Baptist Anglican, so I grew up in the Baptist church, but I attend an Anglican church now, and my day job is that I work for World Vision Canada.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you, guys. Yeah, Chrissy, you talked a lot about the word accessibility. And I think one of the things we talk a lot about in Well Dweller community is our understandings and the meanings we bring to words like disability and accessibility. I think of you mentioned Jesus as well and his followers in I think it was John 9 when he asked him, why is this man born blind? And it's because they're coming into the story of disability with a certain understanding and meaning. And that same struggle, I think, is still happening today in Canada and in the world, where we're still trying to figure out, what does this word disability mean? Accessibility is also, again, there's so many meanings we could have around that as we use that kind of language in our communities. So maybe if each of you could share a bit of how you and Deeper Communion and your communities have defined or brought meaning to that language of disability and accessibility.
Do you want to go first, Cynthia?
Sure. I think I struggle with what it means to be the meaning of it in my community. I don't know what that is. So maybe I'll start with my own struggle with the term disability. I really do think that it is a term that it just cannot be defined well. You know, we could say that we all have a disability, which is true in some sense. But that also would really mean some people that have more issues to deal with day by day, that we kind of undermine their experience if I say I'm also disabled, right? So there needs to be a balance there. And then obviously, the label disability has a lot of social, legal, political concept attached to it. And even in the educational system, you need a certain label to access services, right? So, you know, if I'm part of, I used to be an occupational therapist, sorry. I didn't say that when I was introducing myself. But so in that world, in the health world, and I work with children, so in the education world, some labels are definitely required for you to access certain things. So, you know, and that defines the disability in a very narrow sense, right? So, and that's, I'm sorry, jumping around a bit, but that's really gives you an idea why I struggle with responding to the question of what disability means to my community. You know, I feel that I come from different sections of our society, and each part of it has a different meaning. Even within the church, the word disability often means something visible. So people in a wheelchair, people who are blind, something that you can see of what people usually understand as a disability. But we all know there's so many things that are invisible that would cause what we say as a disability or certain limitations or struggles with our daily living, right? So I do struggle with the definition of it. And, but with Deeper Communion, I think our definition is very wide. We are purposely really welcoming people, more self-identified as living with some kind of disabling experiences and inviting their voices into the conversation, instead of limiting like who. So we have people who talk about their mental health issues, and you know, we have people who use the power wheelchair and the whole gamut. It doesn't matter who person who will share their experience living with a church community and helping us to understand what is challenging, what needs to be changed, how we can actually really come together to belong as one body in Christ. And that's what we are aiming for in the Deep Communion. And the other focus is Canadian. We feel that, I know I'm not defining disability, but there is kind of a disability concept there. That, and we talk about, even concepts of disability, services available for people with disability. It is very different in Canada as compared to the rest of the world. And the Canadian voices, whether it's theological or from people with disabilities or from other fields, we feel really lacking. So what we want to do is really promote Canadian voices so that we can understand more broadly what it means to what this really big term disability means and how it affects all of us.
Thanks, Cynthia. Yeah, I would definitely resonate with so much of what you said, in especially what do we mean, the struggle with the word disability. My graduate studies were primarily around disability language and rhetoric. And what we know is that basically the language that we use to describe people of historical difference changes according to whatever is important at that time. So maybe that is a medical, during the 19th century, when there was the birth of like psychiatry and mad doctoring and, asylums and things like that, there was a language that was created around those medical advances of scientific exploration, sort of thing. And now, my apologies, now there is a, political, social sort of emphasis. Yes. Okay. I can't help you just at the moment. I'm so sorry. Ella's here. She wants ice cream. So our language that we use around this changes according to our society. And Mommy, that's why it's a struggle. I will help you after I'm done this call. Okay. Okay. All right. Thanks. And so there isn't like a threshold of like, if you have certain disabling factors, then you are classified as disabled. You're right, Cynthia. And so that's why I like to say something more along the lines, which it's a mouthful to say kingdom praxis, but really to understand the fullness of the body of Christ is to understand everybody on our journey to wholeness. And there isn't kind of one side or the other. Also, from working in the UK, I've also discovered that depending on the country you're in, whether that's UK, the US, or Canada, there are certain best common ways of referring to disability, and that can get confusing too, because the UK has a very different view on the word disability. They also prefer identity first language as a general rule. So you'd say a disabled person instead of, in Canada, we prefer person first language. So person with a disability. And then when we talk about accessibility, I think for me, like, it's just ensuring that every person has access to the gospel. So if they can't hear and there is no opportunity for, like, there's no sign or interpreter, they don't have access to the gospel. If there's a child who has sensory challenges in a classroom and there's no way for them to be able to process the information that's being presented, that's an accessibility issue. The ones we think about, obviously, are things like ramps into churches. So it's any way that we try to access are we putting up barriers for people to access the gospel?
I like that. Like the very
Yeah, that's both of you. Those are beautiful descriptions of ways we communicate around disability and accessibility. I think I kind of use kind of the language of, it's not so much an absolute definition or absolute language for disability, but rather a relational language we have for disability, and it's communicated both individually, as you were describing, Krista, and communally, as Cynthia, you're also relating to. And it's beautiful to see us exploring this. Why do you think that stories of those with disabilities are so important for Canadians and for the church itself? Why is it so important to amplify and bring up these voices so they're heard in a much more inclusive way?
I've made Cynthia go first twice, so I can. So I personally believe in a collective understanding of Imago Dei, so that we understand God or we know God from the collective. It's not one person. And I believe that he created diversity. We know that when he created the world, when he created all the different animals and all of creation, there was diversity in that. There was difference. That was the night and the day, the land, the sea, the animals that fly, the animals that swim. So he created this beautiful diversity, and he created that within humanity as well. And it's only through understanding and speaking to and hearing the experiences of others that I think we can fully understand the nature of God. And I think that this day and age, I think one of the challenges that we face is society becomes so loud. This productivity that is ingrained in us, this output has become so much dominant in the cultural conversation that those voices are so important to say, is the product that we're putting out the most important thing, or are there other ways of understanding God and our communities as the body of Christ?
I want to pick up from what Krista left off from the last chapter. I really, really like your ideas of accessibility being accessibility to the gospel. I think that is something that I personally also really find very important when we are talking about the concept of belonging. When we talk about belonging, we often think about relational ideas of belonging. But I feel that in a church context, what we need to belong is first and foremost belong to Christ. And so we need to think about how people, like you said, have access to the gospel. And then further, then we need to think about how people can be discipleship into being a followers of Christ. And those things is what I see is missing from a lot of discussion, even in the belonging and disability theology. We often stop short of just getting into the relational side of things. And then why is that important? Again, I'm picking up on what you said from the Imago Dei, from the creation. I think if we believe that God created humanity with all differences, and we are rejecting, ignoring some parts of these differences, we do not have a full picture of humanity that God wanted us to have. And so I do feel that disability really challenges us to really think a lot about humanity. What does it mean to be human? How do we be human together? And how can we enlarge our image of God that each one of us bear? And that doesn't happen until we actually have all of the different pieces that God has given us and revealed to us this particular piece of the image of God. So that's why I think it really is important to the church. But for the society as a whole, we are missing a lot of what in the Christian term gift. But there's a lot of contribution people with disabilities can make that could be brushed aside if we don't recognize that they have values for our society.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, we're talking a lot about this idea of Imago Dei and being in the image of God, and how it's important that we raise up all the diverse ways in which that is expressed in creation, and in our neighborhoods and communities. I think as we do that, we have to recognize that there has to be established dignity brought to all expressions of life, including the dignity and equality of those with disabilities. In what ways does deeper communion empower and equip disabled community and those around them to bring that dignity into an equality across in the church? Yeah.
I would say we have a lot more to learn and a lot more to do. So I think the limited thing that we have tried to do is to emphasize the ideas of work. And so in all of our meeting, we try very hard to invite speakers who lived with disabling experiences so that they can speak. They can share with us what it means to be living with the experiences, and they have a lot to teach us. And so I think that is important. But again, as I said earlier, I think we need to do more. We need to listen more. I think we can make a lot of assumptions, but we need to really come to it with a more humbling gesture to learn.
Yeah. I hear what you're saying, Cynthia, about listening. And one of the things I always have a really hard time as a person with a disability, being a spinal cord injury since 1994, over 30 years, is I think sometimes society has tended to compartmentalize the disabled voice. So when it comes to listening, they segregate that off to the disabled world. Go listen to yourselves is essentially what ends up happening, which is extremely frustrating. And so on the one hand, I want to say, yeah, we need to do some deeper listening into Canada's communities and the church of the disabled voice. But I also want to see, I mean, this is just personal bias, but I want to see action. I want to see involvement. I mean, let's start creating those inclusive environments. And, I don't want to just keep talking about it. I don't want to just keep listening to it. I want to start doing it. And so I struggle with, how do we start doing this? Because the more we just keep waiting, I mean, how long is it that we wait before we start ripping off the tiles off people's roofs and saying, you know what, we've talked enough about accessibility. Let's make it accessible. I don't know how you guys might want to respond to that.
I always keep coming back to the passage in Matthew where Jesus cleanses the temple. And I love this picture because he's clearing out the tables, throwing out the people who sell pigeons. And I say it's more than about commerce in the church. He's making it accessible, because this outer part where they did all the trading and everything is where those people could come who had those physical disabilities, like those who were lame could sit and listen to the gospel. And so those people selling were actually taking up that space, and not allowing those people to enter in. And so that's sort of the picture that I got when you're saying tear off the roof and make it accessible. And I think I think there's a couple of things that I know that on the West Coast we've talked a lot about. So much of it is leading by example, and getting the conversations going. I'll tell you a bit of a story in that I have a friend, Sarah, who She has CP. She's in a wheelchair, and she is part of our church. And we had a parish retreat recently. And I said, Sarah, if you want to come, I'll be your helper. Like, we can make this happen. And it was kind of interesting how the mental barriers that were in the minds of the staff of the church, thinking, oh, I don't know, like, we can't do all this, like, adaptation, to get her. I'm like, it's easy. You just rent a van and then you drive her there. That's it. Just the retreat center had a wheelchair accessible room. And so it just kind of took them getting over that to be able to see that. And for Sarah, it was a huge thing. She had not been away from home in over a decade. And it actually, through our conversations, sparked something in her, because she always sort of felt like her disability was something she almost like wanted to push it away, like didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to talk about any sort of accessibility issues, or like just accepted when they said, sorry, you can't come on the retreat. But it's not really a parish, like a church retreat, if the whole church can't come. And so I just felt like that was a real turning point for our church, and everybody so, so many people said they were blessed by Sarah being there. She's an incredibly wonderful, intelligent person who contributes so much to the conversation. But even, in the case that she didn't say, for example, didn't contribute to the conversation, just getting over that barrier of saying, we can make this happen, and pushing through and almost forcing the conversations to happen, to say, like, let's talk about this, because there are definitely ways to improve. And the other thing is making space for people with disabling experiences to, or living with disabling factors, to be able to speak. Because I think you're absolutely right, Eric. It's like, go and preach to the choir, please. But that's not actually going to help anything. And I think there's this stigma that's attached to even say, if somebody, like yourself, there's like this shutdown, like people don't want to hear about it. But I think making space for those conversations more widely in the church is so important. So it's something we've definitely focused on in our conversations on the West.
Yeah. And even, I feel that in the deeper communion, it's what we have been talking about in our own feedback. We haven't done well enough in inviting church leaders to come to the conference. And so the actions that we want to see don't get out enough. But I also want to give you a story, and hopefully it's an encouraging one. I really do feel that it is a culture change, right? We need to help our church congregation to change their ideas, their understanding of disability, so that the more that we talk, the more that we help them to listen well, is how it's going to get started. So I'm not going to give you a name, because if you're going to Google search, you're going to find it, and I don't have a prior position. So I'm only going to tell you, it is, I don't know if you know the our Common Calling conference. You don't, that's okay. Don't try to look for it, because you will find it. So our Common Calling is actually a Canada-wide conference organized by Evangelical Fellowships of Canada. So it is a conference by invitation. So they each years have a focus. So like the previous year, they would be looking at second generations of immigrants. Yeah, give you an example. So anyway, 2024, our Common Calling conference, I named a young woman with cerebral palsy, non-speaking. She doesn't even want to use a speaking device. So she used a personal assistant to help her communicate. So I nominated her, and she was invited And so, again, this is a representative from across Canada, and they're named church leaders invited by EFC, right? So it's an occasion for her to actually share her experience, her encouragement. And like what Krista said, people are very touched. They begin to see somebody who can easily be ignored because she's non-speaking in a power wheelchair that not a lot of people listen to, but when she actually speaks, they know how powerful it is. And I think it is still a beginning of a shift that we need to try and promote.
That's awesome. Yeah. We're talking a bit about hope, and that's something that's important, I think, for any advocacy for the disabled, meeting the gospel and good news for all people. So as we think about hope and being active in practicing inclusion, how might we begin to ask our communities to take more inclusive involvement with the disabled community? How, maybe some more stories, if you have some more stories about how deeper communion, or how your community is maybe trying to expand that inclusive involvement.
Well, for me is word of mouth. So when I'm staying with the Alliance context for a moment. So when some pastors begin to catch the idea and they started talking about it within the pastoral circle, things started to change. And I do want to share an encouragement in my portfolio. I actually do see very small, and I wish there were more, but steady changes within the Alliance. I invited more to preach on disability, and people have reached out with specific situations that they're dealing with and asking for help. And in those examples, I could see a recent one, an ongoing one. There's one church in Toronto. They have a teenagers with quite significant autism that they have accepted to come to the youth fellowship. And so there's a lot of pushback on other families, and the elder board was concerned because of behaviors, as we could imagine. But this pastor, I think this is where I can find hope, is not giving up. So he is the one who reached out to me and asked for help and advice to what they can do to help this young person to be more integrated. And he also mentioned that they have 3 other children with autism in their children ministry. So they actually just inviting us in as being the Alliance Disability Ministry team to be helping them in the church. So I think I can see hope with some small changes in our churches. They obviously want to see a lot more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think there are small changes. I was questioning whether I should say this, but I still think it's true in that people are trying. Don't always get it right the first time. And I know that some people would disagree with that and say, just get it right. But there's a lot of unlearning of behavior that has to happen in the church. We have created spaces, environments, and gatherings that follow a certain protocol or liturgy, and unlearning those tightly wound expectations is going to take a bit of time. But I think there's a lot of, number one, encouraging the spaces where there are improvements, as you say, like youth groups, I think are a great one, Cynthia, because, well, first of all, I have a youth, so I've experienced this firsthand, but not only do I have my daughter, but then there's another girl who has Down syndrome who is 2 years younger. So then when she comes up, that groundwork is already laid. And so it's not as hard for her to come in. The youth leaders sort of know a little bit more what to expect. And I've offered, some sort of training and some just tips of like, this is the way to frame this. And here's some tips on how you might, change or adapt your way of thinking or your activities in order to make it more accessible for other people, or even within our church gatherings, making interruptions a little bit more acceptable. Our rector loves Ella because she'll always give a commentary on his sermons, or, so she'll be the first one and loudest one to laugh if he makes a joke. She'll also say boring. It's like not going the way she wants. But over time, those things have just become part of the service. And I think that that's a huge step where we can see hope. And the other place I see for hope is encouraging people who experiencing those disabling factors in society to be able to minister alongside. That was one thing I loved about the Church of England's diocesan disability advisors, is many of them had disabilities themselves. And so encouraging and empowering individuals who are called to ministry, who also happen to be disabled, helping them to fulfill their calling and see their vocation has been hugely rewarding. And I think it's full of hope because they bring an entirely different perspective to ministry.
I love that description, Krista. I have to ask you, was that Ella that we met a little bit ago?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah. I was thinking when you were talking, about this idea of awkward interruptions. And I think that we need to change the way we see awkward interruptions into becoming holy interruptions. I think it's so much better if we call those moments of expression and worship and times of community, we call those holy.
Actually, Eric, there's a Canadian author, Karen Stiller, who recently wrote a book called Holiness Here. It's a great book. Recommend it. And somebody from our church wrote a review of her book, and she actually ended her book review talking about one day that Ella ran into church, like ran into the sanctuary and needed to come to me. And she did. She's like, that was the holiest moment of the whole church service, was that interruption. So there you go. You're resonating with that.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, we're kind of coming close to a close here, I think. I don't want to occupy your whole day, but as rich as this is, I'm loving this conversation. I'd love to ask you if in an ideal world, we are making strides towards inclusivity with disabilities in the church in Canada here. Where would you like to see deeper communion and your communities in 5 years' time when it comes to disabilities and our relationships with those who have disabilities?
I wish I could say in 5 years' time, deeper communion will be a very different conversation. Right now, I feel like we're still at that point of talking about improving accessibility, opening our doors, and, changing the way that we look at services, and so on. I wish we could, by 5 years later, we talk about really more established things, like what Krista mentioned. how can we support a person living with disability experiences to be a minister? How do we actually work together, enriching each other's experiences, not thinking about ability or disability? We could go deeper into what it truly means to be a body of Christ. That would be a dream.
Yeah, I think you're right, Cynthia. I think we would be having a totally different type of conversation, although 5 years will fly by. So I know that it's not that long, but I would hope that pastors, churches are banging down our door saying, we recognize that this is something we could do better at, and please help us. And amplifying the voices of people who have lived experience of disability, have them really leading the conversation and being looked to as the experts, the thought leaders, as we work towards that more full understanding of the kingdom.
Yeah. I hear both of you, and I'm holding hope. I know 5 years is going to blow by really fast, but I would truly love to see great strides in the church and in our country for really building a community that doesn't have to necessarily talk about disability, but have the whole community together inclusively, including those with disabilities. I'm trying not to name names here, but I would love to see leadership put in place that knows that it's powerful to raise up people with disabilities and the incredible ways they impact our community, and not mock them or use language that is bringing the power of disability down. That disability is no longer a negative in our society, but rather a place to see the glory of God. Is that not what it's supposed to be, right?
Amen.
So, just before we go, I'd love if you could share how people can get to know more about Deeper Communion and your communities and the work you're doing with the disabled there.
Great. Okay. So we are working on getting our own website up and running. However, at the moment, if you search Deeper Communion, it'll take you to a past conference site, which you can find out what the conferences are all about, which gives an indication of sort of what we're going for. But as soon as that website is up, we'll be sure to forward it on to you so that you can forward it on to your audience as well. And Cynthia, I'll let you speak to the other pieces.
What other pieces are there? But I think our Facebook page is still working. And so,
yeah, I believe so.
Yeah, we can share the Facebook page address as well. And there some limited information, not a lot. It's still about the past conference, but there are a couple of people who share their comments here and there. Yeah, that's probably about it at the moment.
Well, I would like to thank both of you, Cynthia and Krista, for joining me today on Well Dwellers podcast. This has been a powerful, enriching conversation. You both are inspirational to me, and I'm sure to the listeners and viewers of the podcast here. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.